an artist talk with Luke Heng, who will be sharing about his practice in conversation with fellow artist Jon Chan and curator Roger Nelson. Luke Heng is an artist based in Singapore, so welcome to his solo show. And he translates fleeting immaterial images circulating within cultural archives into paint. Jon Chan works based on themes of alienation and the divide itself. He's interested in the position of being between two opposing conditions, and he sees himself primarily as a painter, and where in his paintings these dialectics play out. And Roger Nelson is an art historian and curator based in Singapore. He works in contemporary and modern art in Southeast Asia. So together they will discuss Luke's practice and his shift through his current solo exhibition, Mechanics of the Snap. And do note that the event is being filmed, but if you're not very comfortable with that, you can sit in this part of the gallery where definitely the camera cannot capture you. And with that, very welcome to the talk. I'll hand over the floor to these three. Great.
Hi. Off you go. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for being here, everyone. And thanks to the two of you for all the thought we've put into this. So the shift.
The shift.
What is the shift?
What is?
I mean, I guess talking earlier, we were sort of. The gallery was sharing with us that many visitors to the exhibition who are familiar with your earlier practice, Luke, see a sort of shift from what was abstraction to what is figuration or representation. And I mean, I guess like most artists, the two of you are sort of a bit resistant to that sort of neat binary of abstract versus figurative. But what has shifted for you? What do you think is different in this show from your previous body of work?
I think there are many instances that kind of suggested there are micro shiftings in my practice throughout the past sort of like 10 years. And I think what this show was, in that sense, a kind of recalibration of proximity, in a sense that I always felt like within my older works, I'm kind of functioning as a facilitator. When I'm making the works, it's always about trying to mediate my intentions, between my intentions and the sort of the agency of the medium. Yeah, so it also sort of expanded into the way I paint, which is to set up this sort of parameter where the mark I make on the painting is kind of far and few between. I kind of let sort of gravity to his work, right? And I sort of mediate between that. But also, while working on those paintings, I'm also sort of thinking about what these non-place paintings could sort of be like if I were to assign them certain kind of visuals, right? So I think that is also a start of working with images, like looking at images and how do they relate to my non-place paintings. So by doing that, there is a shift in a sense that I started working with smaller paintings, with paintbrushes, right? So that kind of haptic response is very different, right? So I think by doing it enough, it kind of gained some kind of momentum. And at some point, I felt that the pendulum sort of swing over to the other side. And I think to sort of make sense of what I'm working on, I need to devote a bit more time and attention to those smaller paintings that I was making. Yeah.
Okay, so there's sort of two parts to the shift you described. There's sort of the bodily part, which is about the process, how the paint is applied to the canvas.
Yes.
Yeah. And then there's the sort of the sources of the image.
Right. Yeah.
The use of images, right?
Yes.
Maybe do you want to talk a bit more about that second one, your use of source imagery here? Where do these images come from? These chairs, this straight jacket, photographing them.
I think to begin this search, I think from the start, I think I was quite loose about it. There weren't really sort of fixed subject matters that I'm looking at. There are a lot more driven by intuition. They are driven by some kind of aesthetic selection. And also like challenges, like what kind of image can I use to present or translate certain kind of ideas that I have at that point of time. So I think it was through this sort of recalibration again, like looking at different body of works that I've been doing, that I sort of landed on this idea of support structure, and also at what point this support structure starts to fail. And that is when I kind of like be a bit more specific in terms of what am I sort of collecting in terms of images.
So would you say it gets a bit more thematic as you go along?
Yes, as I think it's very gradual. It's really
but not narration, right?
I don't think I start from a point of narration. It's very sort of one-off, and how that particular image sort of reflect maybe just keywords, right? Like support structure, rupture, all this kind of like failure, right? So I think if I sort of identify certain of these keywords in any of the images that I see, then I'll be like, okay, can I work with them? And I think it's about building a collection of images that kind of speaks to each other, even though they are quite diverse in that sense.
So all of the paintings working with images, they're all found images.
They are predominantly found images.
Photographs, films too,
screenshots, images that were passed around through between friends on phones, right? Or just random snapshots that I would take.
So in some cases you know the maker of the original photographic image, and in some cases you don't.
Yes.
In some cases it's quite personal, and in some cases it's quite public.
That is the area that I'm working within.
Would you like to maybe choose one image to give us an example of?
Maybe this one. I don't. Since we are sitting here. So this is a picture that I took during a wedding ceremony. So I think it was at that time where no one was around this two particular chair. And I was just sort of reflecting on this whole idea of like how the ceremony is in terms a kind of a support structure towards the family, and how at that point of time, this whole idea of wedding and also marriage, also because this is such a intimate and personal event, but it was held because of a lot of external reasons that I know that the couple would not have wanted the wedding to be held there and then under that kind of conditions. So I think it is in a way like a broader sense of reflecting on this kind of situation where it sort of I would say it's a failure, but it's a very large compromise to the couple that were involved. So I think within that setting, I took it, and I was never really intending to use it as a picture. It is only after a few months after the event and understanding why they sort of go through that ceremony that I sort of have a different sort of take on that situation, that I started to use this image.
And it sort of reoccurs, this idea of a kind of failure, or it's like, would you say it's like a disruption, or like a disjuncture? So do you see that kind of recurring with a lot of the works? So it's sort of like it never quite settles. It doesn't tell you fully what it's about. It's sort of it withholds something.
I think that is a lot of pictures, I think, function that way. Like maybe like like photographs, right? They are always a fragment of a particular time event, and also it also deals with like who takes the picture and where it is being published. I think that is very much how photographs and images can fool us in that sense. Yeah, so I think it's always important to have that kind of the capacity to be able to see images both ways, right? You would kind of like set on a particular idea or framework regarding the picture, but you also need to sort of remove yourself and see yourself sort of making that kind of assumptions, whether they are, based on what kind of reasons. Yeah. So I think there's always a two-way street when you look at images. And as the person who is making these paintings, I think it's always important for me to never close the door, so to speak, right? Always have that sense of leaving the door ajar, right?
Yeah. So I have if I can share this quote. So it's by T.J. Clark, art historian. So, in discussions, I've been thinking about this in relation to the work, so I thought I'll let it out. Okay, so he says, right, a painting's muteness gives it a peculiar advantage over the spoken or written word. And then he also says, painting's advantage then is that it can simultaneously tell and untell the story, not putting it into words. So it's kind of like how I've always felt that's the strong thing about painting, in the sense that it's usually trying to say something, it posits something. But many times, many of my lecturers, when I was, studying LaSalle, many friends, peers, there's this part, it almost speaks like a kind of wisdom. It says, not too much, don't, because it becomes information, and something gets killed in that process. So, we talk about abstraction, and I'm thinking a lot of Gerhard Richter and the blurring, and I'm thinking there's this element that we're familiar with him, with Toymans, this idea of blurring, which is a kind of, not disclosing, right? It's like keeping something withheld, right? So do you connect with this? Do you sense that, in the sense that's something you're responding to? Because I know that the images do correspond to something you that's around your world, but then you're kind of like, yeah.
I think in relation to your sort of like telling and untelling, I think that also kind of informs the way I paint, right? Trying to, because like the painting is definitely 100% me, right? Like through my own thought process and how I arrive at certain images. But I would say that would then be a very close off sort of reading of the work if I were to proceed down that line, right? But so it's always trying to find pockets within the painting itself to allow a second opinion, so to speak, to enter, right? So I think this has a lot to do with like my sort of reading into, like I lead a lot into like the idea of decreation, right, by Simone Weil, right? So I think because these selection of works stems from a very sort of heavy.
Because I can't remember what's that decreation.
So, okay, yeah. So it's like it is a sense of emptying oneself, right? And I feel that the painting is, as I said, is very much about the person who is making it, and I think to prevent that very tight-knit sort of way of looking at the work, I think I in my works I have to be the one that sort of empty out myself from the work, right? Or yeah, so I think that also involves the use of certain palette, certain kind of aesthetics, right? That sort of blurs out part of the images that sort of make it crystal, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so in that sense, it's like, to me, like the works, they are full of gravity, right? But try to find it in me to sort of remove some part of that, right? To allow I would say, the grace of the viewers to partake in completing the work in that sense, yeah. So I think that is how I see me trying to always stop at, in regards to the paintings, always stop at a point where it is still loading, right? It's never quite formed, right? Just enough for people to make sense of it and come to their own sort of conclusions.
Not make sense.
Or not make sense to it, yeah. So I think it is it's just like the works is they are not for everybody, right? So if the work connects to at least, some, I think that is good enough, right?
Yeah. I think there's some nice paradoxes there where you sort of talk about the work being all about you, and yet also you trying to empty yourself out from the work, and you talk about the gravity in the work, but also the sort of the sense of lightness of trying to keep it open and not fixed.
Yeah.
But I want to go back to something that John raised, which is about the blurring, and then you talked about the images feeling as though they're still loading, right? So there's something in this blurring here which is very painterly, right? But there's also something which is very digital, right? I think maybe for us to sort of think through that it might be helpful if you can tell us the process of what do you do with these images. Maybe saying with this example of the two chairs from the wedding, so you took the photograph, right? And what happened?
So it then sits in the phone for a very long time. Yeah.
And that's part of it.
That's part of it, yeah, because I don't want to be too intentional to the T, like I take this picture, I have to use it. It's always sort of like allowing the picture to sort of marinate in over time. And I think because people change, right? So, and also things get revealed over time. So I think perception also would sort of affect how I see that picture. But a lot of pictures or images, I find I would sort of put it through Photoshop, right? I would try to crop it. I would try to digitally enhance it. And a lot of that enhancement is also kind of like blurring it, right? Because I don't know, I think sort of gravitate towards not seeing things too clearly. Sometimes it's a good thing, right? It also allows more freedom during the painting process. Yeah.
Can I add in like what I find interesting and all that? So, when you keep saying you're taking something away, but it's as you're making a thing. So you're simultaneously making and unmaking, which I think, there's just a lot of like contemporary artists these days that this is interesting. But I would go so far as to say, if you link it to Richter, instead of going digital, which I think we can actually go backwards even more. You can even look at someone like Da Vinci and sfumato, which is the kind of atmospheric blurring. But this idea that sfumato is not actually to hide, but to bring things out into light, which words cannot do, but images can. So we see things that we would not have seen if it was not painted. Yeah, so what do you think? Yeah.
Yeah, and also like to build on that, like a lot of the images like are actually quite small. When I started working on them, they are on screens or tablets, then they are not that big, right? So when I sort of print them out onto paper and move them to the studio, then it is about how I deal with. Then suddenly you have a larger sort of screen, right, to translate this reference onto, right, and that is where the blurriness helps, right, because it is not as fixed as a very 4K high resolution image, right? You allow your own sort of intuition to guide certain forms into visuals, right? From nothing to becoming something. Yeah.
So you just mentioned printing the images, is that another step in the process? So you take the photograph, it sits in the phone for a long time.
Yeah.
You change it during that. You mess with it in Photoshop, which is both taking something away and adding something to the image, and then you print it.
I print it, yeah.
Do we see any sort of traces of that printing in the paintings? Like
Oh yeah, so this is definitely a printed reference that I was using. So the lines that you see, the horizontal lines that you see on that cluster of rocks, it's I think it is a decision that was made in the studio. So I will usually print a few sort of references of the same image but different quality. So you know how sometimes like printer, when you set it on like a
goes bad or something.
yeah, on like an economy setting, like when you try to save some money, right? And it prints out like it distorts some of the color. Yeah, so I thought those are sort of like ingredients for you to work with if you sort of stumble, you know, in the studio, right? So like when I was making this painting, I felt that the black area, it was too heavy, and I thought I needed some kind of distraction or kind of like things to sort of soften the black patch over there. Yeah, so I was looking at the reference and I started painting in those sort of defect lines. Yeah,
glitches or the things
the glitches. Yeah.
Right?
So, but in a way, it didn't really help at that moment because it was too stark, and then I have to go back and sort of reduce the color a bit, yeah, to make it kind of work with everything else that is on the screen. Yeah.
I find the colors interesting in the sense that they seem coordinated with one another. It's like this certain repetitions of like the pinks and the blues, you know. As opposed to say someone like Richter, it seems like the color goes outside, follows the images, and he's sort of more like letting the thing operate on its own, whereas you seem to have like your own internal system, you know.
I have no idea. Yeah, I think it is quite gradual. I feel like there's a lot of. I think when I make those printings, right, the colors are not very coordinated, so to speak, right? But the material that we use are quite, in a sense, limited to those spectrums that you are comfortable working with. I guess that is where the color sort of funnels through the paint that you're using in the studio, and I think it's quite normal to be influenced by the images around you, right? So if some of these paintings has been done and they are lying around the studio and you're working on a new one, subconsciously you're kind of like comparing something against each other. Yeah.
That's an interesting kind of anecdote to think about, because it seems as though both the color and the light in the painting is not coming from the world around us, but from images, from screens, from maybe images that were once printed and then have become digitized and that you've manipulated digitally, and then you print it again. There's a sort of sense of mediation or auto-mediation of both the color and the light.
Right.
To the extent that this is not a painting of two wedding chairs. This is a painting of a manipulated printout of a manipulated photograph of two wedding chairs.
Yeah.
The sense of the sort of specificity of place or environment where we are is evacuated.
It's not that important.
Yeah, which is quite different from.
It's interesting because it's like I was just thinking how it's like a simulacrum, you know. So it is basically like internet image, you know, outside of self, but he brings it into the studio, which is a very personal space, and being quite conscious about. Because I do see, you know, because I do know Luke, we're friends, so I know he looks at someone like, say, Robert Ryman, which is very material-based, very much in the studio, and, you know, thinking about the spatial, like not just what we see on the canvas, but, you know, like how it's built, all of that. So it's quite interesting, because one is, you know, like, when we think of someone like Richter, it's like this very outside, you know, like what's happening, and then one kind of very So I see it as kind of like a bit of both. I don't know if you, yeah.
I think maybe subconsciously those guys sort of influence the thoughts a bit, yeah. Because to be honest, like they are the guys that we study, like I studied before even like making decisions like this, right? So like halfway through making this series of work, I think there's a lot of sort of reflection based on like how are this sort of connected to say the non-place paintings. And I think probably it's within those moments that figures like Ryman sort of like
yeah, because I also because there are the sort of, they look kind of abstract works. So those I see as indicators that you have not, because some people, and this is actually quite interesting, there seems to be like a few of my friends who are moving from abstraction to figuration, but then come back, sort of like go against this idea of like zombie formalism and all this sort of thing. But Luke's not doing that. So he's sort of still holding on to that idea of abstraction to a degree. And it's like, you're not like quite like let it go, right? Totally.
Yeah, I cannot really sort of like say for sure, right? Like what am I sort of sitting on the fence, or am I like abandoning I mean, these are just words, right? Like I think when you are actually making the painting, whatever sort of experience that they have sort of gone through you, right? Making different types of work, they sort of kind of like culminate at a certain point, and you just sort of feel that at this point, what can you sort of reach into your arsenal to resolve the work, right? And to make sense of it at that present time. Yeah, so I think that is sort of where like some of these images, I wouldn't even say that they are sort of like figuration or representation, like, because in fact, a lot of people don't recognize what they are. So how can I say that they are sort of successful representation of whatever I'm looking at, right? So it is still a lot of like doubting, right? What you see, and also trying to make sense of whatever it's being translated onto the canvas. Yeah.
I think one thing we haven't talked about though in relation to the works that are based on images is feeling. You talked about it being quite intuitive. You talked about it being both all about you and yet you being kind of evacuated or empty. Right. But they feel to me very emotional. And the emotional register has shifted for sure from the earlier non-place paintings, which for me, the experience of them veered more towards a kind of sublime sort of spiritual sort of experience. So there's a shift in the emotional register, but these are still very emotional feeling paintings. And for me, the feeling is often trends melancholy. A lot of the paintings, like the wedding chairs we've been talking about, it's a scene where there were people that have left. In other cases, we see people, but only from behind. In some cases, like in the large painting here, which is a cake, a birthday cake, sort of very heavily iced, a cake with a lot of icing on it, right? Took a long time looking at that painting to figure out what I was looking at. But where are the people enjoying this cake? Where are the people celebrating with this date? So a lot of the images have that melancholic feeling for me because of the absence or the sort of obscuring or the withholding of the humanist. So maybe before we move on to a different body of work in the show, which is more about process, I wonder if you could talk about the feeling of the works, the emotional kind of baseline.
Okay, I'll try my best.
We all love talking about feelings.
I don't think I like talking about them. That's why I try to paint them. Yeah. So if you really want me to answer this with words, I think that's also why a lot of these subject matters are quite universal. I think that is a very deliberate decision to have this idea of it's like the old works, they are called non-place, right? So if you were to think about it, I would like to see this as non-objects, Yeah, so to keep it as universal as possible, I'm allowing sort of the viewer to bring in their own sort of sensation when they look at some of these items that maybe have something to do with them themselves, right? So I think that is where I try to offload, that kind of responsibility of just talking about like where this images comes from. I want you to sort of partake in that formulation of emotions, right? So of course, like to me, they are very emotionally charged because that is where I drew from, right? Yeah. So and I think that is where I want to sort of leave the works. Yeah. If the viewer sort of pick that up, right, I think it's quite nice, right? Because I think that's also like the beauty of the older works when I really enjoy talking to people, right? When they sort of look at the non-place work and they get a sense of what I was feeling, right? I think then there we connect. Yeah, so I want that element to sort of still resides in some of these more figurative works. Yeah.
I think one of the things you said when we were talking in your studio, which has really stuck with me, is that they're not just kind of, if you like, expressing or communicating emotion, but that you want them to be a kind of a receptacle.
Okay.
For my emotion.
Right. Right. Yeah.
And that perhaps.
So can I add in also, like sometimes I'm wondering also, because when we say feelings, certain expressions and things like that, it has this kind of performative angle to it, so, but from at least my experience when I'm painting, the feelings I have inside might not always correspond to what's happening on the canvas. So do you have that sometimes where the canvas seems to be introducing new situations to you, and then and then you have to kind of choose: do you accept it, respond to it, do you edit in? So I think for me at least it's more complex than that.
But that process you just described of responding to a canvas is probably how many of us respond to digital devices that we use every day, right? So I think that sort of mixing of the analog process of painting is.
I think it's different for me because the digital, most of the time we're doing that with flicking, but like with us in paint, right? It's I don't know. It's like being in a band, You're you're making music together. It's a kind of, you're really soaked in it. So I don't know. But maybe you could be very soaked into doom scrolling. I don't know. Yeah.
I get rejected by the painting a lot of times. Yeah, in a way that you're trying to.
I think famously, because I always remember Ian who's here, would say, if that happens, you turn the canvas around, you don't look at it, right?
Yeah, so it's really about you wanting to do something, right? But also whether the painting wants to receive that as well, right? Sometimes it does not correspond, and then how do you sort of navigate that? I suppose. Yeah.
Can we maybe shift to talking about a different body of work, which is here in the exhibition as well, which I think we're calling the timestamp painting?
Okay. Yeah. Yes.
So for the audience sees these paintings on the wall over here, the vertical stripes one on the right, many part, virtually is printing over there.
Yeah.
These sort of vertical stripes, they're made using quite a different process than the other work.
Yes. So they are being made with sort of residual materials, paint, right? That were being used to make, say, some of the paintings. Yeah. The representational paintings. Yeah. So it all started off as trying to exhaust the material as much as I can. But I think on hindsight, it is about this. This is something I was thinking of recently, like when we were making these paintings, it's always chasing a fragment that was there simultaneously. It's not there as well, right? So the headspace is in a very different sort of era, right? And when you're done with that, this timestamp painting sort of grounds you in a way that it brings you back to the present, right? It is almost like a way to come back into what have you sort of made for the day, because they are usually made at the end of the day. Yeah. So for those paintings, it is really just an exercise of marking time in that sense. Yeah.
So it's trying to exhaust the material, trying to avoid wasting the material. You're doing it at the end of the day when you're also quite
exhausted. Yeah.
And they're all following this same logic, this same rule that you set for yourself of sort of repeated sort of dabbing of the brush.
Yeah.
In a straight vertical brush.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then peering behind or coming out of those vertical lines, there's something that looks like text.
Text, yeah.
What's that doing?
What's that doing?
Is that also exhaustive? Inexhaustible?
I think this was brought forth from earlier exploration of works. I think because the shift from the older works to now, like, have gone through several iterations, so to speak. Yeah. So, but it's like the viewers don't really see them, right? It's all happening in the studio, right? And at one point, I was playing with images or inscriptions that happened behind the canvas, and I want to sort of bring that forward. Yeah. So I think that is the underpinning of why I write these times, right? In a sort of reverse manner. Yeah, I think that is also I would say to write this time, it's also like for me to say, yeah, this is a conclusion for today. Yeah, for today's work.
So you write the time.
So I write
when you're done in the studio.
Yeah, with the work. Yeah,
and it's in a kind of digital format, which bridges from the sort of very manual, processual kind of labor of dabbing the brush. It bridges to the sort of photoshopping and printing,
because they are written in digital format. I've never really thought about that, but maybe you could see that as a connection.
What are they doing in the show?
What are you doing? The timestamps or
Timestamps, yeah.
Yes, I felt that they are quite important in the sense that they happen simultaneously with these paintings. Yeah. So to talk about like this idea of support structure, I think we always talk about how works develop from the studio. How do they sort of influence each other? Yeah. So I felt that this is a good sort of context to introduce some of the more representational works alongside these timestamps paintings. Yeah. So and also like in terms of material, they are out from the same sort of body, right? It's just that they are sort of applied very differently.
Yeah, I actually find them interesting because when you first look at them without the context, traditionally you think it's a traditional minimalist strip painting. So you go in there, and then if you're familiar with all the Greenberg isms and all that, you'll be thinking that it's a material-based work, right? It's like a minimalist material-based work. And then you find out it's about timestamps, it's a way of marking time, but it's also simultaneously you putting the paint down slowly and then waiting for the day to kind of just pan out and letting your thoughts kind of gather. But I think the revelation I had when I was thinking about it yesterday was that it sort of makes you realize that there's someone in operation. There's a word, I think it's called nunc stans, the Latin word. Yeah, nunc stans. But it means like stepping outside of the painting and like sort of registering. So you're outside of time as well. You're standing and you're looking. And I think what is interesting, because if you look at practices like Richter, it's a kind of disavowing of the subject. But here it's kind of reversed with Luke. Like Luke's subject, through the timestamps, it's sort of like his body was around these things. You feel a bit more, when you register the timestamps, there's this kind of like liminal space between. You kind of know. And it did remind me of one of your earlier shows, which is called what was it, waiting for the paint to dry or something, or
Waiting room.
waiting room. Waiting room. Right. So there is that presence, and my conclusion is that these images only make sense through a painter's point of view and through a singular person, Luke. And it kind of everything falls into place, in a sense, which is very opposite from Richter, which would have been the kind of a removal. Yeah.
No.
No comments.
I guess
Just an observation.
all of the paintings that are made with source images are a kind of a collaboration between you in the studio, you on your electronic device, and the author of the original photographic image, whether that's you, a friend, a stranger, another artist, photographer, whatever. Right. Whereas the timestamp paintings, it's just you. Right. It's just you in the sort of wee hours of the morning, exhausting yourself, exhausting the pace, punctuating the process in a certain kind of a way.
Okay.
Is there a sort of is there a certain sort of vulnerability to that?
Vulnerability in what sense? Like,
There's nothing but the paint on the canvas. There's nothing but the process.
right. I think that would sort of rely heavily on, I think, context. Right? Like, I mean, you can also say that this is just paint, and nothing makes sense here. Yeah. So I think personally, I felt those were important because I think it's sort of like, because it allows me this space, this time to sort of again deposit some kind of thought, some kind of labor into this rectangle that eventually at some point of time would remind me of like what is sort of make sense of this paintings. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just saying it's almost like a work that helps you make the other work in a way.
In a way, yeah, because it's almost like, I mean, I was just sharing with Roger like I sort of equate these as like climbing mountains, right? Not that I've climbed any mountains, right? But it's like this act of like submitting, and these are like little sort of peaks, but we still have to descend, right? We still have to,
It's like an exhale. Right?
yeah, you still have to descend from the peak because you don't really stay there for too long, right? You die.
Right. So your timestamps are not just helping you to make the paintings, like helping you to climb up to the peak, but they're also helping you to get back down.
Yeah, in a sense, yeah.
I think a lot of artists talk about these kinds of repetitive process paintings as a sort of meditative process, or as a sort of vessel that allows them to concentrate on another kind of thought.
Mm.
Is that part of what they're doing for you? Are they a kind of a...
For the timestamps, they are definitely not that meditative. If I were to make a comparison to, say, my non-place works, they are a bit more. I would try not to think of anything if I can.
So it's like a bedtime ritual.
It's yeah, it's
meditation, but not really. Right?
not really, because like you're also sort of fighting against this a long day of work, right? And you are still sort of exerting. Like, for what reason, I'm not very sure, but I feel it is at that point that it has its purpose.
Also, why like a line? Why not like a circle, like a triangle?
Maybe is now a good moment to also see
maybe we can look
questions from the audience that can help us to kind of climb down together.
Yeah, sure.
It can be questions or comments. Could be wire circle. Anyone?
Maybe I can answer his question first, because like,
Go for it.
like that is the most sort of natural act that I could make. And also, like, going from left to right is always this you're trained to write from left to right. Yeah, it's just something that you do without thinking too much, right? To intentionally make it a circle, to intentionally to make it really straight, right? That is, again, like
Yeah.
putting too much.
I had the experience when I was in army cleaning the toilets. Got very meditative.
Mr. Miyagi, right?
Yeah.
And there's conversation.
Yeah, thank you for talking about that. I think the line is quite important because it speaks to your own tradition. Like it's something that you want to talk about more because it's not a coincidence, it's not a circle, I guess. Like the line plays a crucial role in previous work circles that you have been doing.
Yeah.
Walking the line through Singapore during COVID.
Right.
Or not being able to the kind of more abstract in the non-place. The line is similarly present in a certain way. So there is something that is a certain kind of history that you can eventually even fall back to. What I find interesting is that you described something when you were asked, when you were asking about what you're trying to do with these ways. Spoke about this I want to go to this point of getting rid of myself.
You know that.
I think these things do this actually. Right. So these are not an after product of this. Right. Actually, these are a precursor to that. For me, thinking about that in a way, because it seems as you has described it, that your physical and mental state at that point is actually reaching at this moment what you were aiming for and describing, how do I get rid of these images? How do I get rid of these kind of processes? I'm aware of them and I really like to work through this, but I want to get beyond that. And it seems that's also when you think why these in here. I think there's an interesting connection.
Right.
What do images keep us from in a certain way. And that seems to be something here that we see the fading images, not fading, the fading colors. I would absolutely disagree with Richter, but it's another story.
Okay. Yeah.
Just as a observation from my end, there seems to be something about the corporality and what your state of mind is there. That seems to be this kind of almost Zen situation. In which time is the last thing that kind of located. I would say, it happened at that point.
Yeah.
Almost. There. If I would see a connection, I see it will come out eventually.
Yeah, I think that's the obvious one. Yeah. This is. I think because we did a project show before, right? That is based on how to draw a line. Yeah. So and also the previous paintings, they are heavily reliant on line, right? Because I think the waiting room show, right, is really just a very simple question of if a line gets too broad, right, does it still remind you of a line or a form, right? If it's too transparent, right, does it then transform into a pocket of space? Yeah. So in this subtleties, right, there's so many things that we can do. So I think that is also part of the idea when I was thinking about doing that square thing with you, right? So it's again very demarcated by lines, shapes, and also limitations. Yeah, but it's just sort of executing it in a very different form, right? Method, right? It really involves the body going out to the site and trying to make sure, right? Confirm that these sites are accessible or not, right? Yeah. So I mean, because this work is not really shown extensively. So I'm referring to a work that I did actually during my MA, right? Where I was thinking about this idea of painting, but if the corners are being sort of unshackled by the canvas, right? How far can it go, right? So I'm using Singapore as a sort of ground to sort of mark that square, that four corners, yeah. and I will try to get to the four corners physically, if possible. If not, then I will sort of scale it down based on the next closest location. So I think lines it's just very
so that's
intuitive. Yeah.
Very large, very abstract in the sense of not existing in front of us on the wall.
Yeah.
And conceptual in the sense of something that needed to be planned, right?
Yeah.
Kind of a line. Whereas the line that we see brown and other colors running vertically through that there is like the lines that punctuate the fields on place paintings as well. So there's various different kinds of lines coming up again and again and again. And it sounds like while that might be largely intuitive, it's not entirely intuitive. It's something you're aware of. It's something you're thinking about.
Yeah, I think it's also like treading that line of consciousness, right? If you are too sort of aware of where the source comes from, sometimes you lose it, right? Because then you sort of try to dig a bit further, like where is it coming from, and then you sort of like reauthors everything, right? So if you can just be a bit delusional, sitting on that line and just let it influence you, I think that is also an approach that you can take.
Actually, somehow it reflects some of the things we were talking about earlier. I was just thinking, even with the image paintings, how there's a kind of, if you go too far this way, then, sort of, you lose what you were originally intending to, blah, blah.
Yeah, so it's always try to
Walk the line.
Yeah, walk the line.
Are there other questions?
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about, you started talking very broadly about binary between abstraction and representation. And in the course of discussion, which I've learned a great deal, thank you very much, I think the focus had been on how Luke is very much about, at the end of the day, a kind of subjectivity in the spectrum of images in the creating, so such as Roger's comment about fitting, and John's keep asking that unlike Rico, as in terms of remover, for you, Luke is always about coming back. So it is about, at the end of the day, the subjectivity of the artist. And this is my inadequate understanding of this.
Yeah.
So I wonder if we can broaden the whole binary of abstraction versus representation through living in the world and the possibility of living beyond. So in a broad sense, realism is about living in a world. And even John, I believe we discussed this last time when you quoted T.J. Clark about the painting is telling and not telling. But at the end of the day, T.J. Clark was a social art historian. So it is about the agency of the artist. It's about artists living in the world and doing what they're doing, right, at the end of the day. So I just wondering whether we could expand this discussion to say that, it is at the end of the day about living in the world, but, incorporating the full spectrum of abstraction and
Wants to go. So I think what's interesting about being a painter is that all the time, especially I think today a lot of the art we see around us it's very vocal. It's very informative. It's basically a lot of it's kind of like the spoken word now. Whereas in painting, it seems that as I'm painting, even something as simple as a tree, what do I know about this tree? So inherently for me personally, because I don't see myself, I'm different from Liu, I don't see myself as an abstract painter, but I do think there is a thing like there is abstraction. In a sense that I think we get very influenced by Greenberg and how he's turned that idea of abstraction to materialist understanding. But I also think that there's a kind of abstraction in very simple terms, right? It's just this idea that the world's so large, or there's so much we don't understand, and we create a form in which we're trying to describe this very complicated world. So I actually don't see myself very far away from my friends who are abstract artists as well. So I don't So for me personally, I've always struggled with people who always want to kind of tear the binary or like to make these distinctions. I think now I'm trying to, we're trying to think with me and some of my painter friends, like how do we actually use painting as a form of utility to understanding our world, instead of thinking of it as a limited form, or like how do we expand it, how do we include abstraction, you know? So that's my take on it, yeah.
Living in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyone else? Can we have someone last?
Just thinking about your previous works where you had the kind of like, I don't know the title of the series, but the blue kind of space which you remove the paint and then it has this white glowing marks, right? Is that kind of process of removal done in these works only because there's a lot of like exposure kind of like.
Yes. I think that process of removing paint is something that happened quite sort of late in this series, because there is one painting in the smaller room that was probably made in the earlier sort of stages of this. There's a lot of addition. Yeah, I think when I sort of try to bring in a bit more of my older works, elements from the older works, I try to think about that removal and how can they sort of exist in this. And I realized that I work very thinly with the oil paint, and a lot of those dry brush are sort of loaded with actually like turp instead of like paint. So by painting with that turp, it is in a sense removing pigments from the surface. Yeah, so it's quite similar to those older paintings that you saw when I try to remove paint. Yeah.
I think I can ask that because I feel like you are kind of removing things from the painting that you don't really want to show us. There's this kind of idea of covering up and not showing things. And I feel like actually it's like really chaotic inside your mind. And I feel like these paintings make it seem like very like still. Yeah. But I feel like there's like this kind of like underlying.
Yeah. Please don't expose me. Yeah. But a lot of the white is they are not empty. They are sort of application of white paint, and I think that is where that space that I try to leave it a bit more vague for the viewers to sort of decide if they are dense or they are a void, So yeah.
Can you remove yourself with turpentine?
I can. Yeah. If you drink enough of it, you will see.
Yeah, I think sorry.
How about we take care of it and then we finish?
Okay.
Go ahead.
I was going to say that I feel like what's most interesting to me about these paintings is that when you look at them, they remind you of how images predominantly circulate in our contemporary visual economy, wherever you are in the world, like how you are seeing them on the internet, as you described, like as a poor quality cell phone image, like failed images, overexposed images, blurry pictures. But then you're kind of extracting them and you're doing something very different to them, like printing them out, and then you're evolving them in like processes that are obviously bodily because you're engaged in the act of painting, and obviously slow. You're in the studio, you're exhausting yourself to the end of the day. And so I'm wondering, like in this process of translation, like how you as an artist think about your position in relation to these two kind of economies or trajectories of image movement that you're working across. And do you see your work as an artist, as a painter, as a kind of, I guess, like response or resistance or, a pushback against the way images are distributed and seen now and the way vision operates now? Or maybe are you like really kind of celebrating that and bringing that into how you work painting? Like what do you feel about it?
I think the answer is kind of in your question, this idea of resisting. Yeah, because I like there's no escaping visuals these days, right? They are all in our little black box. in our pockets, and it's really like, yeah, it's gotten to me. Like I'm a victim of that in a sense that sometimes I find myself like on the phone for too long, and then you have this like projection, like I left my body and look at myself looking at the phone. It's like, what are you doing? Like, yeah. So in a way, it's sort of like subjecting to this very fleeting images, to a very like labor-intensive moment where you're sort of like resurrecting certain like images that you sort of resonate with, and you want to work with them, and you sort of spend weeks, months, looking at just one image. Yeah, so I think to me it is kind of again a recalibration of patience, attention, and also like resisting this very fast and frictionless devices. Yeah.
Would you say that it's interesting because that's kind of like a collective desire? Sometimes I like René Girard. He has this. He calls it mimetic desire. So it's a triangular desire, as compared to when you're painting. You have it's sort of lined up with what you sort of desire as an artist. So it's kind of that's why it's like rejiggering it in a sense. Yeah.
Yeah, because you mentioned about white space.
Yeah.
So I'm really glad you brought that up. Because you guys talked a little bit about loading.
Okay.
Remember you mentioned
loading, yes.
And I think, this idea of when you wait for something to load and it doesn't load.
Yeah.
So that's how I see some of the work. But that's the reading from the top here. Because I think the white space is so important in these works, in the sense that kind of like confuses the viewer. You think you see something when you don't. I need to figure out this was a character. And I think this idea of you choosing how much this information you want us to perceive. And the information also is not really correct. Like the faces, you're not sure why is face kind of like this color. So there's always this information that you're controlling to load.
To load.
But there's things that are not loaded, still loaded, or still loaded.
Yeah. Except in the timestamps where there's almost no white at all.
Okay, it's just a comment.
Maybe that's a good moment to end on, that perhaps the loading can continue, the conversation.
I'm still loading.
Continue. But thank you all for being here, and thank you, John and Luke, for
thank you so
sharing
much for
generously.
being here.
Thank you everyone for being here.
Next painting can be in a loading circle.
And then